Okay, so we've seen in the last video some examples of how to log to the output log. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove these from Begin Play since we don't need them right now. But just remember, you can download the code for each section of this tutorial series so you can have that for your reference. For now, we're ready to continue with our shooter character, and we're going to start by creating a couple of private variables. We're going to tend to keep most of our variables private and only expose public getters and setters when we need to access and change those variables. Now we have some sections denoted by access modifiers here. I'm going to create a new section below all of these, and it's going to be a private section, and this will be for our private variables. Now below that, I'm going to create another public section. Now the reason for this is because I'm going to be creating a bunch of variables in the private section, and oftentimes those are going to be forward declared. Now since I'll be forward declaring the variable types up here in the private section, then I can place the getter down here below without having to forward declare it. Let's solidify this concept with an example. We want a camera and a spring arm for our character. This is typical for most characters in video games. So first we're going to create a spring arm component. This is of type uSpringArm component. And since this is not just a simple base data type, it's going to be a pointer. And we're going to call this camera boom. Now notice the compiler doesn't recognize uSpringArm component. And I don't want to have to include the uSpringArm component's header file in here just so that the compiler recognizes it. Instead, I'm going to forward declare it using the class keyword. By forward declaring it, we're making a promise to the compiler saying that, don't worry, this class does exist. You just don't need the header right now. Later on in the .cpp file, when we actually use it, we'll include the header file there. So thanks to forward declaration, we can save on the size of this file without needing to include unnecessary headers. Now since I've forward declared this class here in the private section, I can create a public getter that returns this type without having to forward declare it again. So I can say uSpringArm component, it's going to return a pointer, and we can call this getCameraBoom. And as you can see, the compiler recognizes it since we already forward declared it up here. Okay, so we're creating a getter for CameraBoom. Now it's a good idea when we're creating a function, if we don't plan on changing any members of this class, to make this function const. All this function is going to do is return the value of CameraBoom. That's what a simple getter does. If it's a simple getter and we're not changing anything, the practice is to make this function const. And to make the function itself const, we put const right here between the parentheses and the body of the function. Now since this is a simple function, we can make this function inline with the force inline macro. This causes this to be an inline function, which means somewhere in our code, when we call getCameraBoom, by the time compilation is complete, that function call will be replaced with literally what's inside the function body here. So at runtime, there's less jumping around by the flow of execution in the code, which can save on some performance. In general, you want to use very small, simple functions with force inline, and it's the compiler's decision ultimately whether or not this function actually gets inlined or not. Okay, so we've created our CameraBoom pointer, and we've created a getter for this pointer. We want our CameraBoom to have the uProperty macro. If you're not familiar with the uProperty macro, I suggest you take my course, Unreal Engine C++, the Ultimate Developer course, where I describe uProperty in detail, but just know that this marks our variable for garbage collection as well as allows us to expose it to blueprints by using various uProperty macro specifiers, such as Visible Anywhere. Visible Anywhere allows this variable to be visible both in the details panel in the blueprint as well as in the details panel for an instance in the game. We're going to make this blueprint read only, which means it will have a getter node in blueprints in the event graph, but it will not have a setter node. Let's give it a category of camera. This will give it its own category in the details panel. And finally, we have this in a private section. Since it's a private variable and we wish to expose it to blueprints, we're going to use the meta equals, and we're going to use allow private access equals true. Now I know that this is a strange syntax, but this allows us to have a private variable exposed to blueprints so we can still access it from within our blueprint. Now a camera boom is used to attach a camera to the character and keep it at a certain distance. So we're going to add a comment to this. And it's going to say camera boom positioning the camera behind the character. So that way we have some sort of idea of why we have this camera boom pointer. Now for the getter, we're going to also give this a comment. And the comment is going to say returns camera boom subobject. So now we have a variable called camera boom, and it's a pointer that points to a uSpringArm component. But this is not a uSpringArm component. It's just a variable that holds an address. And right now it doesn't even have any valid data in it. We haven't even constructed a uSpringArm component. For that, we do it in the constructor. So here in shooterCharacter.cpp, in the constructor, here is where we will create our camera boom. And we do so by saying camera boom equals, and we use a function called create default subobject. Now this is a function that constructs a new subobject. It takes a template parameter, which is the type of the subobject you want to create. In our case, it's uSpringArm component. Now it takes a parameter, which is a text string. We're going to use the text macro to make sure it's Unicode. And we're going to call this camera boom to name this component. So once the shooter character constructor gets called, we actually construct a new SpringArm component subobject, and we assign its address to the camera boom pointer. Now since we want our camera boom to be attached to our character, in other words, attached to its root component, we need to call a function called setUpAttachment. So let's get camera boom, and we can use the arrow operator to access its function setUpAttachment. SetUpAttachment requires you to specify a component to attach it to. And we're going to use root component, which is simply a variable inherited by the actor. It has a root component. Now take a look at the red underlining camera boom. Pointer to incomplete class type is not allowed. This should tip you off that you need to include a header file for something that the compiler doesn't recognize, and it's saying uSpringArm component here. Remember, we forward declared uSpringArm component here. The compiler didn't recognize it here either, but we promised it with forward declaration that we would include the header later. Now that we're trying to use it, we need to include it. So up here in the includes is where we would do so. Now there's a couple of ways to find out the path to a header that you need for a particular class. We can take a look at the SpringArm component class in our Solution Explorer. So I'm going to drag this out and type SpringArm component.h. And here it's showing me the header for it. And if I go down here in properties, dragging this over, I'll see that it's in classes/gameframework/SpringArm-component.h. Now we never need to include anything from classes or to the left. We only need the path to the right of classes. So we can include gameframework/SpringArm-component.h. Alternatively, you can find out the include path by going to the Unreal Engine documentation. So here we have the Unreal Engine documentation open, and you can search for a particular class name. Here I searched for use spring arm component, and down here it says include, and here it's showing you what you need to include. I'll go ahead and increase the font size here. It says include game framework / springarmcomponent.h. You could literally come to the documentation, search for the class you need, and copy this. Then you can come back and paste it here. Okay, so we've created our SpringArm component. The SpringArm component class also contains a property called target arm length. We can set that here in the constructor. Target arm length. And let's set this equal to 300.f. Now, once we set up inputs to control our controller, we're going to want this camera boom to follow the controller. And there's a value that we can set on camera boom to make sure that this happens. It's called B use pawn control rotation. We're going to set this equal to true. What this means is that whenever our controller moves, our camera boom is going to use that rotation. We'll discuss controllers more in future videos, but for now, just know that we're going to use that control rotation for our camera boom. Now let's give this a comment. We're going to say create a camera boom. Now the camera boom pulls in toward the character if there's a collision. So let's add that as some additional info. Pulls in towards the character if there is a collision. Now, right here for target arm length, we can add a comment saying the camera follows at this distance behind the character. And then finally, we'll add a comment here saying rotate the arm based on the controller. This gives us a bit more information about the spring arm component. So we've created a spring arm component called camera boom. Let's go ahead and compile this so we can hop back into the editor and see the result of that. So open up shooter character BP. The first thing you should notice is we have a new component called camera boom of type spring arm component. Select that, and in the viewport you can see a red line. This is our camera boom, and our camera is going to be attached to the end of it. Notice also that the target arm length is set to 300 here. We set that in the constructor, but we can also override that by changing it here if we want to. In the next video, we're going to add a camera component and attach it to the spring arm. So stay tuned.